Hello, my name is Michael Kadis. I'm the Director of Markets and Competition Policy at Washington Center for Equitable Growth. And I want to thank you all for joining, what is going to be, I think, a great session with three excellent papers. Our session's entitled Markets, Innovation, and Equitable Growth. And we're going to explore what drives the equality and pace of innovation and the role of markets and redistribution. We're going to be on the record. And for those of you, I'm going to give the social networking cues. If you want to follow along and tweet about the session, use either the hashtag EG Grantee or EG 2021. And we have conveniently put the hashtags, the Twitter handles of our participants today at bit.ly /EG 2020_SM. Again, that's bit.ly /EG 2021_SM. And I always try to take the rule when I'm moderating or chairing a session that the smartest thing to do is to turn it over to the people you all want to hear, which are those on the panel. So with that, I'll introduce the panelists as the paper and the discussant as they come up. So our first paper is called Redistribution Through Markets. It's by Professor Commoners, MBA class of 1960, Associate Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School. A little bit of a mouthful, and this is a paper that was partially funded by a grant from the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. Professor Commoners, with that, I'm going to turn that over to you to do your presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you all in the audience for coming. Thank you at Equitable Growth, both for having me here and, of course, for supporting this and a whole series of projects with this team of collaborators, Pyotr Dvorak and Mohammed Akbarpour, who are respectively at Northwestern and Stanford. And there's actually a third collaborator sort of on the broader array of projects, Ravi Jagadisan, who just moved to Stanford from Harvard. And so I'm very honored to be speaking about the opportunity to use markets as a source of redistribution. I know that's sort of, there are many ways in which markets can redistribute, but we're used to mostly the case where they redistribute away from the people who might need it. We're going to talk about whether there's a way to use them to give back and sort of actually respond to inequality through the structure of markets themselves. And so the starting point of this paper is the observation that policymakers, at the local government or like individual agency level, frequently use price controls or subsidies or forms of in-kind redistribution as a way of addressing market inequality. So examples abound. There's rent control in public housing, which is an attempt to address inequality in the housing market, minimum wages in labor markets, restrictions on congestion pricing. We're not always used to thinking of those as a price control, but they really are, right? A lot of economists think that you should have congestion pricing on roads where you charge more for driving at busy times as a way of sort of smoothing the use of the road over time. But of course, people oppose these with the concern that you don't want access to the road at peak times to only be available to high income people. And so keeping, sort of the price of driving at zero is a form of price control. And then this paper speaks also, and I'll say some at the end, about in-kind redistribution, think like food stamps through SNAP. And so the starting question is, are these sorts of policies the right economic approach? And of course, the knee-jerk economic answer is typically no, right? We're, sort of in economics, we're generally believers in the power of competitive markets, and the typical strategies you want to sort of maximize sort of total productivity, and then redistribute through the tax system or some like high-level macro system. But of course, here at Equitable Growth, we know that the world doesn't always quite work out that way. Sort of if you just maximize growth, you don't always get it equitably. And what my co-authors and I argue in this paper and in our broader research program is that actually these, sort of market level redistributive programs can sometimes be the optimal policy. And to get to that, we build a theory of what we think of as inequality aware marketplace design. So to give you just like a hint of what's going on here and like where it comes from, I'm going to do something like a little bit odd, which is I'm going to go back to Econ 101. And so apologies for a second for belaboring like a simple like supply and demand curve, but I'll show you the point. So why do we normally set competitive prices? Why are we so in favor of them? Well, of course, it's about minimizing it's about maximizing sort of the total size of this triangle, right? So maximize total productive surplus. And if we say push the price above the market clearing level, so now we're instituting a price floor, there are two inefficiencies. One of them, which we're all very used to, is this deadweight loss triangle, right? We sort of lose some trade that the market would bear. A second one is caused by sort of inefficiency in who wants to supply. So more people want to supply at this high price than want to purchase at that price. And so we usually assume you have to ration. You don't quite know who to sell to, so you randomly allocate. But something that's in this picture that, at least for me, when I first learned economics, I was never really focused on, but it's always in there on that first day, is this blue rectangle, right? So another thing we did when we pushed the price above market clearing is we effected a transfer from the buyers who buy to the sellers who sell. So the sellers are getting paid more per transaction. And so we're getting fewer transactions, but those sellers who transact make more. And if we value seller welfare highly enough, say in this context, the sellers are especially poor relative to the buyers, that transfer, sort of the role of the market in effecting a transfer from buyers to sellers, might be enough to outweigh both of these inefficiencies from the loss in allocative surplus. So simple thought experiment. Rideshare is a market where drivers are on average poorer than riders pretty much everywhere. And moreover, riders have low price elasticity. So if you push the price up, sneak preview, you're not actually going to have that big a deadweight loss triangle because the riders aren't very price elastic. If you were to institute a price floor in rideshare, we'd distort allocative efficiency just as we saw, but we'd improve equity because we'd be giving more money to the drivers who transact. And it's not just that we're improving equity sort of within this market. We actually are finding through their market behavior the drivers who are the ones most in need. And what do I mean by that? I mean, it's the poorer drivers who are more willing to sell at any given price. Like if I fix a price and say, who wants to sell at this price? If I make you twice as in need of money, you are going to be more willing to sell than you were before. And so, pushing the price above market clearing, we're still using the market to find this, to find sellers. And here we're finding the sellers who actually most need that transfer. So the market is sort of very efficiently finding the sellers who are most in need. Really simple, intuition for this. Just think of the dynamics at the start of the pandemic, right? Rideshare became much, much more dangerous as a driver. And yet some people started driving for rideshare for the first time. And what do we infer about that? Those are people who probably had some idiosyncratic pandemic-related need, right? Maybe there was a health shock in their family. Maybe they lost their job or were furloughed. But the market sort of discovers those people before even government aid can get there, right? They sort of immediately you can log onto this platform and start providing labor. But, it's incumbent on the platform organizer or the regulator of that platform to ensure that they get a meaningful transfer out of it. Footnote, we can do even better with a price wedge. So it turns out that a price floor is not the most efficient way to transfer through a system like rideshare. What you really want is to charge the buyers a higher price than you pay the sellers who sell, sort of like a rideshare tax, and then use that to finance an efficient transfer to all the sellers on the platform, something like healthcare that has increasing returns, or convex returns. More broadly, and I'll flash the slide for the for the group, but much more detail in the paper. When there's cross-side inequality, the optimal design is this sort of price wedge with redistribution to whichever side is poorer on average. When there's high seller-side inequality, then what you want is these price floors with rationing. That's the scenario I described before. And the reason for this is, as we were saying, the market price, whatever it is, selects for the sellers who are most in need. And there's a similar sort of intervention on the buy side, which actually looks a lot like public housing programs that you see, and has a little bit to say about which public housing programs work better than others, which is that when there's high inequality on the buyer side, it's the poorest buyers who are least able to trade. And so if you just institute a price ceiling, you're actually helping the wealthy buyers. Right? At any given price, you're helping the buyers who are more able to buy. And so what you really want is sort of a two-part rationing scheme, where like most buyers are buying in sort of a regular market at a market price or a competitive price, but some people are buying a good at a much lower, buying housing at a much lower price, but you need like a lapse in duration or sort of probability of receiving the lower price that stops the people who are wealthier from sort of mimicking the poorer market participants. Two quick policy notes. I mentioned SNAP. SNAP is a great example of exactly that type of policy. I had a piece in Bloomberg in January talking about the idea that SNAP sort of serves as its own means test. It's very difficult to register for, and the benefit is actually not that large, which implies that anybody who's registering for it must really, really be in need. And in fact, empirically, this is what you see. So like, you hear policy conversations around SNAP fraud, but fraud in SNAP is lower than in like almost any government welfare program. And so there's a real sense in which, for better or for worse, the design of the policy is endogenously finding the people who are in the greatest need. And you can also use this type of logic to think about redistributive effects of market dynamics. And so I had a different piece, this one early in the pandemic, about hand sanitizer. Willingness to pay isn't just a measurement of value, right? It's a mixture of your measurement of value and your wealth, your ability to pay. And so at the start of the pandemic, the fact that somebody could pay a very large amount, you saw hand sanitizer cases going up to $80 or $100, like your ability to pay $100 for, $20 worth of hand sanitizer probably doesn't suggest you have a much higher value for hand sanitizer, but rather that you're wealthier. And so like you're more able to pay for it. And so this is an argument against sort of price gouging of the type that we saw early in the pandemic, right? There was sort of a lot of people rounded up hand sanitizer, mostly in fact from low income neighborhoods, places like dollar stores, and were selling them online to a population that was much wealthier and had sort of like much more access in general, and probably also less health need and less need for disinfectants because of their jobs or whatever the case. So that's a very quick whirlwind of my collaborators and my micro market design approach to redistribution. Our general view is that there is a real role for marketplaces to help address a lot of the inequality that markets have created, because those same market forces can help us channel resources to the people who need them most as quickly, sort of quickly, potentially even relative to, sort of more centralized government programs. But it really, really depends on the marketplace design. And so you have to think very carefully about these policies, and there we see theory as a strong guide. So that's our hopeful vision for 2021.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Professor Commoners. And the discussant we have for this paper is Alberto Bazzin, who is a professor of economics at New York University, and looking forward to hearing his comments.
No, sorry, I was muted. You see my screen, right? Thank you very much. Yeah, so I think I wasn't sure about the rules. Do I have 5 minutes for each paper or 10 minutes for each paper? 5 each.
You have 5 to 7. We're
okay.
Try to be equitable here.
Yeah. Okay, so this is absolutely why it doesn't move. Sorry. Yeah. So this is absolutely a fantastic paper. I should say I teach it in my first year graduate course, and you have very tough choices when you do these things. So which papers you choose. So this is really a paper I love. The fundamental idea, the way I see this. Maybe this is my bias, but I see it as a fantastic theory piece. Scott obviously tried to show a bunch of applications which are very important. This is, it's theory motivated by some fundamental idea. So let me just go quickly through this. So the idea, in one way, one way to think about this is, asking yourself the question, prices versus quantities, right? So you want to control prices or quantities as a policymaker in the economy, and welfare theorems don't help you there. You can do either way, and it doesn't really matter in a standard world where the first and second welfare theorem hold. Now, there's a discussion. I like to see this paper as one of the fundamental contributions in a general set of questions which ask this question, price versus quantities, and two fundamentals paper. I just want to cite them because they are unbelievably beautiful paper that have done many things, but they've also, I think, got us to think about when is it that prices, that going through prices the same way this paper goes through is important. There's a fantastic paper by Martin Weitzman, passed away this year, and it's an unbelievable classic, which has to do, and it's very much used. It has to do with thinking about Pigouvian taxes versus cap and trade mechanism, and it's been applied usually, of course, in thinking about environmental externalities. And the idea there is that there's the government doesn't see technological shock. The firms and the players in this market do, and so the government ex ante tries to regulate as an externality, environmental externality. And the idea is you try to regulate this externality. Do you fix quantities or do you fix prices, which is Pigouvian taxes? And there's a nice discussion, even very clean, related to the picture that Scott showed, the demand and supply picture, very clean, very nice, goes to that direction. Another dimension here, there's the famous Rothschild-Stiglitz paper on insurance. There's a similar thing. You can imagine going in that world. You can imagine going to the constrained Pareto efficient point by constraining the amount of insurance that you allow in the market. There's moral hazard or adverse selection. In this case, there's adverse selection, and you don't want the bad risk guys to buy the insurance at the bad risk guys. You don't want the bad risk guy to buy the insurance at the good risk guys. And so what you do in these economies, typically, if you write down a competitive equilibrium, what happens is that you're constraining the amount of insurance that you offer to the good guys. And if the good guys are many more than the bad guys, this is very inefficient, and you might as well write down a linear price and have the bad guys cheat, and who cares? There's few of them, and they don't cheat very much, right? So these are all these are all dimensions. Somehow my thing doesn't work very well. Sorry, I can't. Okay. All right. So I think of this paper really literally as one of the classic papers in this literature. So why is this important? There's a lot of applications, as Scott was talking about. I think, it's the formulation, the beauty of the formulation is really, takes away the quasi-linear utility, indivisible, one of the good indivisible, the other it isn't, private information. It's really beautiful, simple, and gets to the core of the problem, and the result is really very clean. I'm sorry, somehow my thing doesn't work. So he has a mechanism design, and again, he just went quickly through this, but this identification of the cross-side inequality, the inequality between buyers and seller, and the same side inequality, the inequality inside the buyers and inside the seller, that characterizes the whole result. This is a beautiful, clean, and elegant way of thinking. It looks very obvious once you say, you don't even think that there's much behind it, but it's really, really key to the characterization. Okay, so very quickly, you've seen the result. So he exposed the result very well. Just saying words, when the same side inequality, so inside the buyers, inside the seller is not too large, you can have a single price in each side, and you might have a wedge to distribute lump sum transfer across the side. When the same side inequality is substantial, when there's a lot of inequality between buyers or between seller, then you're going to have rationing. And the key of this of the intuition behind rationing is what Scott was talking about, which is really an important dimension here, which is that in some sense the mechanism, the decision to trade is a form of whatever revealed preference. It identifies the poorer sellers and the richer buyers, and this helps the market designer to set the right wedges or rationing mechanism and rationing scheme. So basically the point I want to say is this is really beautiful. So to me, the only suggestion I might have is, every time I read this paper, even in the example, asymmetric information is crucial and it's important. And in the story, of course, in the theoretical structure, it's harder to find. Sometimes when I think about the examples, it's not always obvious that the asymmetric information is crucial, right? So we're transferring here in this context. The asymmetric information is about the value of wealth, right? So the value of money the wealth of the agents, and especially the cross side. We typically know who the buyers are the richer guys and the sellers are the poorer, depending on the context. But in any case, so we typically know which side goes this inequality, and even on the same side. It's inequality about wealth. We tend to know who are the poor. There's many ways in which a government can understand who are the poorer subjects. And yes, market helps, but it's not obvious that this completely takes you away. That's my only point. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Good. We'll now move on to our second.
I got 20 seconds. Let me just say thank you too.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
Sorry. All right, so now we'll move on to our second paper entitled Knowledge Diffusion Markups, Cohorts of Firms. It's by Umberto Moratori. He's a PhD candidate at Georgetown University and was a dissertation scholar at Washington Center for Equitable Growth. Umberto, take it away.
Hello, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for having me as dissertation scholar. It was a great time to be there for me. So today, as Michael mentioned, I'm presenting my job market paper, Knowledge Diffusion, Markup, a Cohort of Firm. This paper builds on two pillars. The first one is markups. Markups are the wages between the selling price of a good and its marginal cost of production. There is some recent literature that shows that markups have been increasing in the last few decades. So increases in market dominance have serious macroeconomic consequences, such as, for example, declining labor share or widening inequality. The second pillar this paper builds on is knowledge creation and knowledge diffusion. Knowledge creation are defined as the production of new innovation that improve productivity, while knowledge diffusion is the flow of the existing technology from the leader to his competitor. Knowledge creation and diffusion affect the technological gap between the leader and the follower, and as a consequence, they also affect the price and the markups that the leader can charge. In this paper, I explore the relationship between knowledge creation, knowledge diffusion, and markups. I address three research questions. I first used historical US firm level data to investigate the markups pattern by cohort of firm. Motivated by this new empirical evidence, I then explore the mechanism, the account for this pattern, and finally, I use a structural model to answer two quantitative questions. The first one is to study the evolution of knowledge diffusion over time, and the second is to quantify the welfare implication associated with changes in knowledge creation and knowledge diffusion. This paper contributed broadly to four branches of the literature. The first one is the markup literature. With respect to this literature, I document the difference in markups between and within cohort of firm. I investigate the determinants that are behind this pattern. The second literature is the knowledge diffusion literature. Most of the paper in this literature are theoretical study. The few empirical study and not quantified and not reach a consensus on the quantification of the knowledge of the changes on knowledge diffusion in the last few decades. I propose an alternative approach, estimation approach, and I contribute on this ongoing debate. The third literature my paper builds on is the innovation policy literature. Most of this paper studied the effect of R&D subsidies on the frequency on innovation occurrence. What I study is a slightly different aspect. This is the innovation step size, the quality of innovation. Finally, the last branch of the literature my paper is linked to is the misallocation literature. The model that I build, the structural model that I build, include knowledge creation and knowledge diffusion as a mechanism, a driver of markups. So I can study what is the effect of the changes in these two dimensions on markups or on misallocation through changes in markups. This graph represents the main report, the main result, the main empirical result of the paper. On the y-axis, I show the average markup. On the x-axis, I report the years of business activity. Each of these lines represents the average markups over time for a selected cohort of firm. There are two main takeaways from this graph. The first one, that there are substantial difference in markups between cohort of firm. In other words, the entrant at the time of the entry charge a higher markup than incumbent. The second takeaway is the markup profile over time is relatively flat within cohort of firm. I use administrative patent data to provide evidence that these two patterns are linked to knowledge creation and knowledge diffusion. The difference between cohorts are linked to increases in the entrant innovation quality. The intuition of the mechanism is the following. Higher innovation quality implies that the leader has a higher technological gap over the competitor, and as a consequence, they also can charge a higher markups. I also show that the markup profile within cohort is the result of two forces, innovation and knowledge diffusion. Innovation is widen the technological gap and push the markup up. On the other hand, knowledge spillover narrow this gap and push the markup down. I build a general equilibrium model, namely a Schumpeterian endogenous growth model of creative destruction, that segmented with a process on knowledge diffusion. In this family of model, in the Schumpeterian endogenous growth model, the firm differ in the technological efficiency. Moreover, they operate in imperfectly competitive market. The markups are endogenous and they are linked to efficiency differential. Efficiency can be improved through innovation decision. Therefore, also the markup are endogenous. It changes as consequence of innovation effort. To this process, I add a process of technological catch-up through knowledge diffusion. In the model, as I already mentioned in the empirical analysis, the markups are the result of two forces. Innovation, that increase the technological gap and increase markups, and knowledge diffusion, that on the other hand, shrink the technological gap and decrease markups. I use the model for two purposes. The first one is to quantify the evolution of knowledge diffusion between 1980 and 2010. And I find the knowledge diffused 38% faster in 2010 than indeed in 1980. The second purpose for building a structural model is to quantify the welfare implications that are associated with changes in innovation quality and knowledge diffusion. To achieve this goal, I compare a baseline economy where innovation quality and intensity of knowledge diffusion are set to the 1980 value with a counterfactual economy where these two dimensions are changes to the 2010 values. My result suggests that the household is better off in the counterfactual economy. More precisely, there is an increase in consumption equivalent welfare of approximately 0.29%. In the paper, I also argue the changes in innovation quality and intensity of knowledge diffusion can be achieved by reforming the patent law. More precisely, increases in non-obviousness requirement, this is the innovation step size required to grant a patent, will lead to more radical innovation. On the other hand, decreases shortening the patenting term, this is the period for which a patent is granted, will lead to a faster diffusion of knowledge. In one of the numerical exercises in the paper, I show that if policymakers want to maximize welfare, they should choose a short patenting term, a fast diffusion of knowledge, and a low innovation step size. This in terms of policy, this translates in low non-obviousness requirement and very short patenting term. To conclude, Today, I present new evidence of the pattern on markups. In particular, I focus on the difference in markups between cohort firm and within cohort firm. I also link this pattern to knowledge creation and knowledge diffusion. I build an endogenous growth model that is segmented with a process of knowledge diffusion, and I use the model for two purposes. First, to quantify the changes in knowledge diffusion between 1998 and 2010, and I find that the knowledge diffused faster in 2010 than it did in 1980. And second, to quantify the welfare implication associated with changes in innovation quality and intensity of knowledge diffusion. And I find the changes in these two dimensions from the 1980 to the 2010 value lead to increases in consumption equivalent welfare gains. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Umberto. And Professor Bazine will also do the discussion on this paper as well. So go right ahead.
Yes, thank you. Sorry for have to see me again. I kept the same structure in the discussion. So fantastic paper too. I didn't know this one. This is it doesn't say much about the paper. It's about me. I spend more time thinking about welfare theorems in theory than on growth and innovation. It's just my own. So I know less about this literature. So there's a couple of points. So let me try to summarize it as well as I can. I really enjoyed reading it. Really interesting and fun. So the problem so let me go through the same structure. So what's the problem? You've seen it, technological innovation and diffusion. So the paper is, very well structured. It's so methodologically very important, I would say, right? So Umberto starts from the evidence and finds really new evidence from, again, I know less about this, but I have no doubt it's very new. Certainly new for me, but I'm sure new for everybody. Very new evidence about the dynamics of markups, and very intriguing. I mean, I kept thinking about this. I could not have expected some aspect of it. I'm going to go back to this new evidence. It's nothing obvious at all. Okay, again, here the decision of going at within and between cohort is crucial, and it's very clever. It identifies something that it's happened between the 80s and now in a clean, nice, and effective way, right? So he looks at this. He looks at so after looking at the evidence, then he's thinking about the model. It's very frontier model, really, to think about growth, right? So it's based on a standard model of innovation and diffusions, but there's all sorts of extra twists that he needs to add to the model to think about exactly what's happening in the markups that he had just identified. And then he's thinking about normative effects via innovation policies. Okay, so why is the problem important? It's important in many ways, obviously. I kind of like this. We talk a lot. So when I went to graduate school, which unfortunately was a long time ago, we only thought about growth. I mean, that's especially in Chicago, where I was from, right? So where I studied, it was growth and growth and growth. Okay, so it was the Lucas, the Romer. Now we kind of lost that a little bit, I would say. I don't know. This is also a judgment from outside. I think we speak about these issues less. We talk more about fiscal and monetary policy, of course, on demand side. We even growth theory now is the role of institutions. Okay, are crucial in growth theory, historical economics. I love this whole literature, but we kind of lost a little bit. It seems to me. These basic growth models, and it's very important to go back, right? So growth is fundamental, and innovation and technology are crucial to think about it, and so it goes back to something very crucial. To me, this is in some sense very important. So how the problem is investigated, as I said, right? It's methodologically very clean, nice, and comprehensive. You start with new evidence, you write down a model, a structural model. You estimate the structural model to understand and see if the model fits the evidence. And then you now have your nice estimated structural model, and you can do counterfactuals, policy counterfactuals, and otherwise trying to understand the structure. So both on a positive and a normative way. Okay. So you've already seen the picture. It's the crucial picture in a sense, and you know it's so there's two dimensions of this. There's one dimension is that over time you see curves go up over time. So over time the markups have grown up. So over time I mean of course. So new cohorts have higher markups. But what's really impressive that I would not have expected is that these markups stay constant. Somehow this means that this new firm innovate more, larger step size in Umberto's words, innovates more, but they kind of keep this advantage over time. The incumbents also innovate, of course, but you know they can't really eat away from the markups fast enough. Okay, so that at least is my understanding, and it seems something not obvious at all. While I could have imagined ex ante that the step size went up, not very obvious that it would stay constant. The markups to me, I couldn't have said that. Okay, so again, so if you look at consumption equivalent welfare, you already said 30% increase from the 80 to the 210th, smaller effects on growth. Now, policy implication, you want to have low steps and short term. Okay, so you want to have very fast diffusion. Diffusion went up from the 80s to the 2000, from an half-life of 80 years to an half-life of 5 years. So diffusion went up, step size went up. Now, the only issue, and I'm going to get to this, that I was confused about is this issue of step size. So step size, I didn't completely understand. So step size is, in one sense, is a positive phenomenon. The technological innovation is the kind of technological innovation that we've seen from the 80s to now, to 210 in this case. It's of different, qualitatively different. Okay, not just quantitative. It's a different object. So I would imagine step size to be determined in part by that. You know, whatever it is that we're innovating, it's different and it's weird. Okay. But then the paper also thinks of step size as an effect of policy, and that's obviously correct too, right? So he's thinking of step size in terms of the patent system. How big must my step be to receive a patent and hence monopoly power for a while, right? So I didn't really get this distinction here. I don't understand if in the model step size is purely policy, or if there's both dimension, and which one is winning which and how. This I was confused in the end about. And that's the only point that I want to make. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Umberto.
Great. Now we will move on to our third paper, fiduciary duty, and sorry, so I'm not looking away. Fiduciary duty and the market for financial advice. The presenter is Professor Patti, assistant professor, University of California, Berkeley Law School, and this was also partially funded by a grant from the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. Professor Patti, it's turning it over to you.
Great, thank you, and thanks for the invite. This has been a great community for our work. This is joint work with Vivek Bhattacharya and Gaston Yanes, both of Northwestern and the NBR. So this project is trying to address a question that's of live policy relevance. So I'm going to give you some background on the market we're studying in particular, but the goal is to understand whether we can use fiduciary duty, which is a legal solution, to fix a theoretical economic problem, which is principal agent issues. And the setting we're going to study it in is the use of retirement age workers going to financial advisors with the goal of growing their wealth during retirement while providing some money or income for end-of-life expenses. So this is a difficult market that's fraught by conflicting incentives. Advisors have an incentive to recommend high-fee products that have low net returns because they're paid by commission. And fiduciary duty is a legal fix that's intended essentially to hold expert agents liable if something happens. There's a bad product sold, or an elderly customer is dissatisfied. Well, these advisors may face lawsuits and legal liability. There's been a large patchwork of regulatory attempts here, including a failed federal rule, the Department of Labor rule that I'll try to come back to, and the latest federal attempt to regulate this called the Best Interest Rule by the SEC. And the challenge they're facing is that historically, all advisors are not fiduciaries. And what the legal community is trying to debate is whether it's a good idea to extend fiduciary duty and use this more widely across financial advisors. The debate focuses on whether it's focuses on its efficacy. So specifically, proponents are saying, well, net returns to investors are going to increase if there's the threat of legal liability. But detractors, and we try to take both sides seriously here, the detractors are saying fiduciary duty is going to increase fixed costs. So this is basically an extra legal headache that doesn't really change incentives. And all it does is it's going to lead to exit of advisors and ultimately cut down on access to financial advice. So the open question we're trying to deal with here is how fiduciary duty actually impacts financial advice. And we're going to show you some empirical results. So what's the setting for our approach? Well, we're going to study the market for deferred annuities, which covers about $3 trillion in retiree wealth across the country. What our data set allows us to do, it's one company that shared data with us, a major financial services provider that we'll call FSP. They gave us data on all their annuity sales between 2013 and 2015. And we have quite detailed information about the customers, the advisors, and the products they sell. And we also see the financial advisor market, which intermediates this market. So the full set of financial advisors who sell these products and their characteristics. And finally, we gather more information about these products, these annuity products, and try to come up with a valuation for them, essentially trying to understand what the expected net return is for a retiree to invest in any of these products. What do they look like? Well, we're going to study two types of products, fixed index annuities and variable annuities. And these are very hotly debated products because they are potentially where elderly customers are going to park their entire life savings. So these are big contracts with a lot of consequences for policy. They're intended to combine investment vehicles with insurance. So I'm showing you two sort of sample products here. On the left, a fixed indexed annuity, which is intended to be like the S&P 500, but it has a floor and a ceiling on the returns. So you never can lose the principal that you invest into a fixed index annuity. While on the right, I'm showing you a variable annuity where there is the possibility of losing money. This is the blue line that can potentially drop, but you have the choice to turn your investment product into an income stream. And that's this red generosity here that's plotting how much you're going to get if at age 80, you decide you're going to retire fully and want to take all your money out to pay for your nursing home care. Well, this is going to give you that possibility at a really high price or high generosity. So what we're looking at is products that really have potential to be of value to retirees, but are fraught by kind of market failures. And specifically, fixed index annuities, they are simpler products. They're less likely to get confused by relatively inexpert retirees, but variable annuities are complex. And there's a lot of concerns that these are being used to hide fees and essentially take money away from retirees. We take advantage of some regulatory variation in this. So we look at state common law across states and see that some states hold their broker dealers, which is one type of financial advisor, as fiduciaries, and they're the darker blue states here. Then the light blue states are those in which the state common law doesn't hold broker dealers to be fiduciaries. So we look through court cases and we validate this classification. And what we are struck by is that fiduciaries in these darker blue states are required to recommend the best possible product for their customer. So this is supposed to bridge the principal agent gap. While in these light blue states, the broker-dealers can offer any suitable product, even if it's a higher fee product. So what we're going to do is use a difference in difference approach with a little bit of structure added on at the end in the model section. And what that's going to do is compare the two kinds of financial advisors we observe in the market: broker-dealers, who are subject to this common law fiduciary duty that varies across states. And we're going to compare those across state borders to RIAs, registered investment advisors. And these are regulated at the federal level, and they act as our control group. So we have a control that is unvarying across the country and a treatment group that, that does vary. And we use the borders between states as a natural experiment. So this is a border where on one side there's a fiduciary duty on broker-dealers, and on the other side there isn't. And our border sample alone is 22,000 transactions, 140,000 each. So this is looking like a retiree sample of $3 billion just in our borders alone. What do we find? Well, first, we create this net return product. So what we say is, for each product, we want to understand what's the equivalent risk-adjusted value you get out of that product, taking into account all the complications in the products that we mentioned before. And what we see is that our control group looks exactly the same in states with and without fiduciary duty. This is the distribution of risk-adjusted returns. Our treatment group looks different. So in states where there's a common law fiduciary duty, broker-dealers are selling products with higher risk-adjusted returns, where the risk-adjusted returns are increased by 25 basis points on average. We also do another measure of unadjusted returns, and that is increasing by 47 basis points. What we find is that this is driven by a shift in the market. The entire market shifts. And there is evidence here both for the proponents and the detractors. So I'll try to make a case for both of them. On the proponent side, this looks like really good news for the investor. You're getting better products. You're less likely to get the complicated variable annuities, more likely to get the fixed index. You're less likely to get downside risk. You're going to have more investment options. This all looks like it's good for the investor. However, you get exit, and this is what the detractors are concerned about. You get some amount of exit of broker-dealer firms, 16% drop. There isn't a change in the number of contracts or anything like that, but it raises our sort of concerns that we need to do more work to understand what would happen if we were to continue to strengthen fiduciary duty, which has been the proposal at the federal level. To do that, we build a model, and the model basically proposes that there are two mechanisms that could potentially be at work here. The first we call the fixed cost channel. And the fixed cost channel essentially means that fiduciary duty is imposing something like a cost to hire lawyers, liability insurance, all of these things that are not really related to advice itself. If that's the case, and that's the reason why fiduciary duty is operating is through an increase in fixed costs, we should see entry and exit, as we do, a change in the number of broker-dealers, and that in turn might change the observed advice. On the other hand, the advice channel, which is what we think is the proponents or like the optimistic view of what is happening here, is that the advice channel works directly to increase the cost of distorted advice. So this is when every advisor thinks, I'm concerned about my liability risk, and I will try to change my behavior to comply more intensely with fiduciary duty and recommend the best products. Under the advice channel, we can see some entry and exit because it's expensive, perhaps, to provide good advice, but we also see a direct change in the observed advice. So we see two channels by which observed advice might change. So we do quite a bit of work that I'm going to skip over to try to quantify what each of these two channels contribute to our result. And what we find essentially is that there's a dominant effect of the advice channel. What that means for us is that if we were to continue to increase the stringency of fiduciary duty, so this is, for example, the Department of Labor rule that was struck down may have made it more expensive to comply with fiduciary duty and also made the potential costs higher. We can model this as an increase in stringency, meaning that 1 is where we are right now, the state common law rule that we're studying, and then if we move it to 3, this is like 3 times the damages, 3 times the liability risk. if we were to increase stringency by 3 times, we see that there isn't a bit of exit. So this is the number of entrants in total. We see a little drop of about 0.5 of a firm. And this is consistent with the detractor story. However, we see that it's dominated by the advice story, which is this one on the right. As you increase stringency, you see that the distortion, meaning the number of basis points that you lose in your product that you're recommended, is actually improves significantly. So you get less distortion, and therefore this is about 20 basis point improvement as you triple stringency of fiduciary duty. So our takeaway from this is that we feel comfortable saying not only that state common law fiduciary duty improves investor returns, but that fiduciary duty generally in this market for financial advice is good for investor returns. So even though there are potential fixed costs, even though there's the possibility of exit, and we try to take that seriously, we see that that's dominated by the advice channel. And that means this contributes something to the ongoing debate about SEC's Reg BI and what the new administration might do when it is confronted with this issue of financial advice. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll now turn it over to John Sabelhaus, who is the visiting scholar at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, for his comments.
And here we go, slideshow. Great, everybody see my screen? Michael, can you see my screen? Good, thank you. So thank you so much for inviting me. This is really a fabulous paper. It's a great piece of work, and exactly the sort of thing I think Equitable is designed to invest in. So there are 2 main takeaways, and I think the first is really just a fabulous data set and effective estimation strategy. It's hard to argue with the main conclusion that broker dealers with fiduciary obligations are a lot like registered investment advisors, and they steer customers to higher net returns. That map with the border states and the overlay of the different distributions of returns, I think, make the point really clearly. The second part of the paper is about the model and trying to take a model to decompose this net effect into higher compliance costs, which lowers returns, and the constraints on low quality advice, which increases returns. And it's that tension which I think I want to focus most of my comments on. In a strategy like this, where there's so much to talk about, I immediately turn into a Bayesian in terms of developing my comment strategy, because I asked myself, what was my prior going into this? Are the empirical results in the modeling strategy consistent with my priors? And if not, should I change my priors, or should I think about another type of model? And that's part of what I'll end up doing. I think the answer is it's basically consistent with my priors, and maybe there's a slight tweak to the model or another version of the model that the authors might look at. So my priors are pretty simple. If a friend or relative asked me, should I go to a registered investment advisor or broker dealer? What's the difference? My limited contact with lawyers over the year has told me there's really one big difference, right? The answer would be you can sue the registered investment advisor if they put their interest before yours and give you bad advice. So it's a 2-step process. Their interests have to be ahead of yours, and they have to give you bad advice. And that answer really is the key to my priors. I assume that a registered investment advisor worries more about getting sued, and they will thus act in a way that balances that risk of getting sued against higher income that they could make. And that's the key to what I want to talk about. And in fact, indeed, getting sued is on the list. So the authors give us this great couple of paragraphs. The first one says an advisor with fiduciary duty may be drawn to fixed annuities for a variety of reasons. First, fixed income annuities tend to have higher risk-adjusted returns, and advisors may be aware that such annuities tend to be better deals and thus less willing to push variable annuities if they have fiduciary duty. So that's one. The second one is more about getting sued directly, right? FIAs are simpler to explain to clients because they do not include income and contract bases or the complex riders that come with VAs. A shift to simpler products may limit the likelihood of the advisor being brought to the courtroom or arbitration by a client who claims fees in terms of not being properly explained. So clearly they had this in mind. Manisha, I think in her presentation, indicated they have it in mind. And I guess the two paragraphs here, the juxtaposition really, pushes me to ask, if advisors know that FIAs are better deals, what reason would non-fiduciaries have to steer customers away from the FIAs? And this gets back to my main point. My prior and the registered investment advisors who advertise on my radio station, and yes, I'm confessing that most of my priors are based on the ads on my radio station that say you need to invest with us because the other guys charge higher fees. That's the main key. And we have, there are ads that very clearly say, we have fiduciary responsibility. We have to put your interest ahead of ours. And they're implying that they're giving up these fees in order to better serve your interests. And I guess that's what they're arguing, that these non-fiduciaries have this incentive that they don't have. And so does a broker dealer push people away from the FIAs because they make less money on an FIA, or is it because they don't know any better? Is there something about their own skill set? And this gets into the sort of cost versus the advice channel. Is there a cost of becoming more knowledgeable about these products so that and they're not paying that cost? Or is it something that could be directly measured? How much are you earning when you sell a VA versus an FIA? And what are the implications for the model? This model is very, very rich. It is one of these masterpieces of theory brought to bear on a legal question, I think, in terms of both the supply and the demand within the market. And it captures the cost of providing good advice. That's a key component. But the question here is, can or should we interpret at least some of that cost as the trade-off between the advisor's income and the risk of getting sued? In other words, they say, look, if I'm a broker-dealer, I can take a little bit more of a chance of pushing this higher fee product, knowing that I can't be sued as easily as the RIA could be getting sued. And this is important because this model is really developed to extrapolate, I think, beyond the fixed versus the variable annuities to other types of products. And here's where the nature of the cost likely varies across financial products. And that leads me to, should I change my priors? And the answer is probably not. The cost that the authors are writing down, I think, is capturing what I have in mind. They make it clear this is what they have in mind. It's about this trade-off. It's a cost. But the main concern here would be that the same cost function or relationship of cost wouldn't apply to other financial products in the same way. And that leaves me with a very simple comment or suggestion, asking, is it possible to write down a more explicit model where literally an advisor is trading off the probability that they get sued versus the additional income they can have if they sell a product that earns them a higher commission? Is there a way to write that down? Right now, it's collapsed down into this thing called cost. And the question is, could it be written down in some sort of stochastic decision-making framework? Again, with that, I think my priors remain largely intact. The ads on my radio station, I think, are still very compelling, as is this paper, which was a joy to read. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Michael, you're muted. There you go.
Which was pretty good. It took me 3-4 times before I forgot to unmute. That's really high for me. Usually it's the reverse. So I thought those great papers, great discussion. As we get close to the Q&A from the audience, I'm just going to toss out some questions and sort of go a little bit in reverse order and start with Professor Badi. In your paper, you discuss some empirical results on the existing legal intervention of imposing common law fiduciary duties on some broker dealers, develop a model to study that mechanism, separating the fixed cost channel from the advice channel. So I guess my question is, how and why did you decide to separate these channels, especially when considering alternative legal reforms like SEC regulations, or perhaps the temporarily at least defunct Department of Labor rule on fiduciary duties for financial advisors?
Thanks, Michael. And yeah, thanks, John. I think this gets a little bit to your question too. We did try to do a little bit more than just establishing, I think, or matching our own priors. We could have stopped. I also had the prior, John, that that fiduciary duty was a good thing for investor returns, and was happy to see that in the data. But we didn't want to stop there. We wanted to take that extra step to understand the mechanisms and write down the model. John, I wish we could write down a better model of advisor fees and commissions. We don't have that data, so it's not right for our setting. But I think you're absolutely right that, you know, theoretically that's a key parameter. But what I'm hoping, what we were able to achieve, I think, was to get to take seriously the concern of exit. So this is, I think, a pretty challenging thing to do in legal analysis, because we often look for natural experiments and we're stuck with the equilibrium that we see. So we can't know directly from the reduced form data whether or not this is there's going to be some perverse consequences from expanding duty that goes beyond, that has more general equilibrium effects, let's say, than the observed intervention. And state common law fiduciary duty is relatively a weak mechanism. So for the law side of things, it's basically waiting till there's a problem that arises, someone complains and starts a lawsuit, and then the court goes through the facts and decides on a case-by-case basis whether or not the fiduciary duty holds, which is really inefficient in a lot of ways. And that's what the DOL rule was trying to do, was say, well, instead of doing it this way, let's have class action lawsuits, and let's allow people to band together and sue a company that we think is doing this on a regular basis. And so from that perspective, we think, you know, there's some inefficiencies to state common law, and the concern is that when we remedy the inefficiency and we think we're doing a good thing, we actually have some perverse effect. So anyway, I want to highlight that this kind of analysis that we were doing is one step towards trying to take seriously the market effects of expanding legal regimes. And we think that in fiduciary duty, it's a safe thing to do, because we've done a lot of work to try to establish that. But hopefully all legal interventions kind of take this seriously if they're thinking about taking a natural experiment or reduced form evidence and taking it to policymaking.
Michael, can I jump in just real quick? What do we know about the broker dealers who exited? I agree absolutely that sorting out that exit mechanism is just, it's a fabulous contribution. That's why I said the cost side, exactly how you design it, I think we can interpret it the way we want to interpret it. But and it's the fact that it allows you to separate out the exits. But what do we know about those guys?
Yeah, we're doing more to characterize them. One thing we do know is that they're small firms. So they're typically local footprint, small broker dealers. And because we don't see a change in the number of retirees that are actually going out and getting annuities, we think this is a sign of consolidation. We don't see it's not a strong enough one that we can pick it up and say this is more concentrated market now, but it looks like, you know, now if you're an independent BD, you don't just work out of your garage, you want to go and join Raymond James or a big company. So that's using an example. So that's the kind of metric we're looking at, and a lot more needs to be done.
And then you can afford radio ads.
Exactly.
Yeah, whether that's a positive or negative effect, we'll leave to another day. I want to turn to Umberto's paper. So Umberto, you talk about the literature that's really sort of almost exploded on markups over the last couple of years. And to terribly oversimplify, we can sort of break down that there's I sort of like to categorize it. There's two groups. The paper you cited, the DeLocher and Eckhouse, you know, it really talks about growing markups as a sign of a competition problem and increased sort of monopoly power that's detrimental. And then on the other side, there's a series of papers, the Auteur paper with Van Reenen and others, that sort of suggests that the reason we see markups increasing really has to do with, they call this the superstar firm, that it's the most productive companies, the most efficient companies that are driving increased markups. And this, beside the methodological issues about these papers, which we could bring in an IO economist who most of them would think twice about this literature, but setting that aside, this disagreement has a lot of policy implications. And so I'd like to hear your thoughts. What do by looking at the cohorts, does your paper help move forward this discussion, move us towards synthesis, suggest that we need to rethink about the debate? Just how do you sort of look at the contribution of your paper?
Thank you very much for your question. Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. It's actually should be at the core of the policy debate. So as I see my paper, this is in between the two streams of the literature. That's because the cohort effect is hard to explain as declining in competition. This one is more linked to obviously technological advance in innovation creation. On the other hand, once you go to the within cohort behavior, within each cohort, you see a lot of heterogeneity across firms. So you will see firms, they have actually increasing markups, and firms, they have declining markups over the life cycle. These two effects, in the result of the show, they kind in aggregate offset, leading to flat markups within cohort. So what I'm trying to say is that once you see this heterogeneity, you will see this some of the firms, they have like a high growth in markups are actually firms, they are innovator. They are like a strong technological and productivity advantage relative over the competitor. And in this case, this one will be consistent with the story of the superstar firm. They have like they are more productive, they're like a large share of the market. But on the other end, there are among these firms, some of these firms that become like they have like higher markups. They have increasing markups. Some of these firms are no innovator. So that means that there are, in addition to innovation, other forces that might also push markup up. So what is my thought is that one should take in consideration the actual reason why markup are growing, and should like really disentangle how much the two story matter in the increase of markups, and try to obviously take try to make the markup increase, try to preserve the increase in markup due to technological advances, must try on the other end to decrease the market competition coming from no technological innovation. I think that is an avenue for future research.
No, it's very interesting. As there should be a notice in your chat. We're about to getting close to audience question and answer. So any of you, please put some in questions, because panelists, I'm sure, be happy to hear questions from the audience. But before we go to that, I'm going to turn to Professor Commoner's paper. So one of the things in your paper, Professor Commoner, you explain an inequality amongst market participants. Hold on, sorry. An inequality among market participants increases competitive pricing. As an inequality among market participants increases, competitive pricing can become dominated in welfare terms by mechanisms that may involve distortive features such as price wedges and rationing. And so, not being being the lone non-academic, my doctorate's actually not a real one; it's a JD. I was just wondering if you could sort of explain what it means for competitive pricing to be dominated.
Sure. So first of all, I should say, someone who comes from a family of all lawyers, JDs are known for asking the most incisive and best questions, and this is actually a really good one because this is essentially the core question of the paper. So when we say that something is dominated in welfare terms, we mean that with respect to the social welfare function, so the rule for evaluating outcomes that society or that policymakers have set, you can do better with a different mechanism. And there's actually a very simple version of the thought experiment I was giving before that can help you really get an intuition for what this means. So if you imagine that we have sellers who are poorer than buyers, and we make the sellers poorer and poorer. Competitive pricing, what happens at the competitive price? Well, the sellers are poorer, so they are more willing to trade, right? They need money more. And competitive pricing takes advantage of this to like clear the market and like execute more and more trade, right? So in the limit, as I make sellers destitute, they'll sell, whatever their good is at an arbitrarily low price. But in a social welfare perspective, because they're so poor, we want them to have more money, all else equal. And so, these effects move in different spaces, right? But they're clearly moving in opposite directions, right? The poorer the sellers are, the less money the competitive market mechanism gets them, but the more the social planner actually wants them to have money to to mitigate their poverty. And so in that sense, even for single price mechanisms, so even if all you're doing is fixing a single price and saying we're going to do as much trade as we can at that price, if your sellers are sufficiently poor relative to your buyers, we say that the competitive price is dominated. It's not the optimal thing to do. And what our paper does is characterize what the optimal mechanisms look like instead.
Great. So we have a question from at least the panelists. I'm going to define audience to include the panelists. John, you wanted to ask a refining question.
So Scott, I think it's just absolutely fabulous the way you're thinking about this, and I'm just trying to sort of what Alberto did, map this back to what we teach, our students. And I guess the way I would say what you're doing is you're assuming that the buyer and the seller are sort of inherently the same in terms of their preference orderings and their income expansion paths, everything we would think about, and they're just at different points on those income expansion paths. And therefore I can count the utils of the sellers and utils of the buyers as though they're effectively the same person. And I agree with everything you're doing, but let's pretend for a minute that I wanted to critique you. What if the two people, the buyers and the sellers, were very different, and you really can't just count utils like that?
Beautiful. So we actually have an answer to this, which I submerged in trying to make the talk more accessible to policymakers today. But really, all of the math in the paper, what we're doing is we're studying mechanism design with heterogeneous welfare weights across participants. And so what you should think of is not, that it's necessarily just, somebody's level of wealth, but rather the welfare weight that the policymaker places on them based on everything that they can observe about that person. And so what's happening is you're watching people's market behavior reveal information that enters the welfare function. You could think about this, for example, in vaccine distribution, right? People's, willingness to show up to get a vaccine on the first day. Sorry for picking a highly, sort of highly, personal or an issue that we're all thinking about, I'm sure, at this moment. But someone's, willingness to show up on that first day reveals something potentially about their own private, sort of private demand for the vaccine, but also might reveal something about their externality. So if you're the type of person who is in a job where you have to interact with lots of people, you might choose to show up very early because you're interacting with lots of other people. And that informs the social welfare weight. So we might put a high social welfare weight on that person receiving the vaccine early, even if it's not, about a wealth or non-wealth disparity. So actually the model seamlessly adapts to exactly the question you're asking. But again, we're not taking a view on the social welfare weights. We're asking policymakers to do that. Thanks. Great question.
So it's interesting you went to the virus example, because while you were presenting the paper, actually, and you were talking about the inequality on one side of the transaction, I was thinking about the virus example that we might, in a market situation, it's the NBA players who are getting tested and who would be able to, if we just allow the price mechanism to determine rationing, the wealthy get the virus and not necessarily the people that, as a policy matter, need it the most.
So the reason the vaccine is on my mind as an example is we've literally been trying to work through a framework for this right now. And your intuition is right? If you just allocate the vaccine based on cash, it goes very much to the people who have more ability to pay, but for lots of different reasons, both for equity reasons and for externality reasons. A lot of people who should get the vaccine very early are people who are in one fashion or another disenfranchised or unable to be the ones who would show up in a cash market. And the slightly counterintuitive idea here, so we have a follow-up paper called Redistributive Allocation Mechanisms, which we really wrote entirely with Equitable Growth support. So thank you guys again. The counterintuitive thing there is you might want to have a small amount of a cash market as a way of peeling off the people who would prefer to buy, and basically to increase the extent to which the public market serves the people who need it the most. And so if you think about like a developing country where the public market might not be able to serve the entire population, there actually you want a private and a public market operating simultaneously. And theory can give you some insight into like which types of people you sort of want to run through each market.
Very interesting. So we have a question for Professor Body. So the question is whether the paper is able to address post-exit. What happens if that exit creates market power? Is that built into the model, or is the sort of just assumes the competition level's the same?
Yeah, great question. So we have a relatively simplistic version of competition in the model right now. So we do account for the fact that when there's exit, there's a larger, you get a larger share of the market, but we don't think of it as increasing markups, largely because we're kind of assuming that once you have two participants up in the market, we're getting something like a oligopolistic competition. So yeah, it's not gonna scale particularly with if you can go from 4 to 3 advisors as opposed to 3 to 2, like there's not some differential effect. But it could happen in real life. I just want to note that the way pricing is set at the advisor level is a little different than the way we're thinking about price. So we are measuring net returns, which means the total loss, the total fee that is paid to both the upstream provider, which is our FSP, and the advisors themselves, who are intermediaries in the market. So the intermediaries don't set the price. So that's one reason we're sort of extrapolating away from the product space actually changing, because the product space can't be affected in our setting by the advisors. They would have to be done by the upstream provider and their competition, which we're not modeling at all.
Right. So I guess the question was sort of getting at whether the brokers would increase their fees in the face of less competition, and how that might affect the model.
Yeah. So just to clarify, the brokers don't. So brokers set the split. Or can help set the split in fees between the upstream provider and the advisor themselves. But what we're observing is the sum of those two. So we can't actually tell you, like, this is one of the reasons we can't address John's question, is like directly modeling commissions, which we would love to do. We don't have the data to tell you what the actual commission award is to the advisor. So we can't, we have to sort of necessarily abstract away from brokers repricing, because all we think of is the upstream provider FSP's repricing, and that's all we observe. So yeah, we in theory it could happen, right? But it could even be happening within our context, and we just can't observe it because we think of two products being sold by two different broker dealers having the same price as long as they are priced the same by FSP.
Got it. Okay, so Umberto, back to you. So when you get to sort of at the end of the paper, as you're talking about, you sort of point out that there's sort of, I don't know, trade-off or tension, that if you have a system that a patent system that maximizes welfare, you want to maximize knowledge diffusion. You want the innovation to get out into the economy as fast as possible, which sort of translate into a short patent term, right? But at the same time, you sort of want to have it relatively easy to get a patent, sort of low, what do you call it, low innovation requirement. And whereas you want to if you want to maximize growth, you're going to do the reverse. You want long patent terms and tougher patent requirements. So I guess the question I have for you is, I guess maybe this puts you on the spot a little bit, but I mean, that's an interesting trade-off. I think cynical lawyers might say the U.S. system does the worst of both. We have long patent terms, and it's too easy to get patents. But if policymakers were wanting to sort of build off this research and say, well, so how do we figure out how to sort of get to the ultimate place? What kind of research needs to be done to sort of figure out how to best balance these two goals in this trade-off?
Yeah. Thank you for your question. Yeah, indeed, in the paper, I do like some numerical exercises. If the policymaker want to maximize both, I mean, the policymaker cannot maximize both welfare and growth at the same time. But if there is this trade-off, so if they have as their goal both welfare and growth, they have to find like a combination of these two dimensions. It's a good question. I think the policy, I mean, I think, and it's part of my also research agenda to understand how changes in the patent law might affect like these two dimensions. I think the first things to do is to really understand well what are like the trade-off, where the trade-off come. And for that, one is to understand what are the behavior of firm, why firm innovate, and under which circumstance they innovate. So I think like it's important that first to understand what is the better understand the behavior of firm, and then to design a policy that can like actually maximize the innovation decision of the firm.
No, that's interesting. So I think that's all we have for questions. So if someone has a question, you should type it in shortly, because otherwise I'm going to thank in a minute here. I want to thank all of our panelists, both the papers and the discussion. I think very interesting topic. This notion of, I think innovation and how it affects marketplace and how the relationship of inequality and market structure, I just find fascinating. As a sort of competition lawyer, it sort of touches on a lot of issues in ways that I don't think about these things. And so I don't know how in the virtual world we give people a round of applause, but I think you all deserve one. And so I see we have no more questions, so I guess you get 8-9 minutes back of your life, and hope we see many of you at future events for our conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Pleasure.